The attack on Maranatha Dinner Roof went in there and killed 9 innocent church-going people. That same time, Cecil the Lion was killed. And I remember they happened about the same time. And 2 things happened as a result of that. One is that people were so upset about Cecil the Lion dying that all the men who did it, the doctors, I believe they were from Minnesota, they did it. They were castigated, ran out of business. The other thing happened is that people formed and sent money and formed a group of guards, and they'll guard that pride, and they haven't lost one person since then. That pride of lions that Cecil came from is well guarded. They've learned that lesson. He is protected. Black people have even died, still continue to die. Still continue to die. No award, no jury, no municipality giving somebody $20 million is justice. No supplicate, no saying plegatory things like, oh, well, we all feel bad. That's not justice. Justice is this man who took that man's life and those officers who were involved being not only taken their occupation taken away from them, their reputation taken away from them, their freedom, and forever. Because this was a murder. They're not degrees of life. They are not degrees. They want to have to degree this out because that is the only way we can see people as human. It's to section it out. Oh, this is 3rd degree, this is 2nd degree, this is intent, this is manslaughter. He murdered that man and knew what he was doing and dared anybody to do anything about it. They dared anybody to do anything about it. You do not have to agree with the group Black Lives Matter. You do not have to change your political affiliation. You don't have to change your ideas. You don't have to do anything other than be human. And you don't have to say all lives matter. You don't have to say this or that. All you have to do is look at that video and say to yourself, this human being, this man on this day, his life matters. And the only way you couldn't do that, the only thing that would stop you from doing it is if you lack the very humanity you always expect. That's a little note from the GED section. We got the Jazz Report coming up in 15 minutes. It's the DLU.
How can God allow all this to happen?
We used to ask that. Now that his hand is gone.
Breaking news tonight from the New York Times. For the last couple of nights, we've been focusing on this remarkable and stomach-churning story about an active criminal investigation into pro-Trump Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz. Well, the New York Times has just significantly advanced the story. I haven't had time to digest this. I'm just reading it myself for the first time right now, but I'll tell you the lead. Justice Department investigation into Representative Matt Gaetz and an indicted Florida politician is focusing on their involvement with multiple women who were recruited online for sex and received cash payments, according to people close to the investigation and text messages and payment receipts reviewed by the Times. Investigators believe the former tax collector in Seminole County, Florida, Joel Greenberg, who was indicted last year on a federal sex trafficking charge and other crimes, initially met the women through websites that connect people who go on dates in exchange for gifts, fine dining, travel, and allowances. Mr. Greenberg introduced the women to Congressman Gaetz, who also had sex with them, according to 3 people with knowledge of the encounters. The Justice Department inquiry, the Times says, is also examining whether Gaetz had sex with a 17-year-old girl and whether she received anything of material value. According to 4 people familiar with the investigation, the sex trafficking count against Joel Greenberg involved the same girl. The Times has reviewed receipts from Cash App, a mobile payments app, and Apple Pay that show payments from Mr. Gaetz and Mr. Greenberg to one of the women and a payment from Mr. Greenberg to a second woman. The women told their friends that the payments were for sex with the 2 men. And the 2 men here, Greenberg, the guy from Seminole County, and the congressman. In encounters during 2019 and 2020, Mr. Gaetz and Mr. Greenberg instructed the women to meet at certain times and places, often hotels around Florida, and would tell them the amount of money they were willing to pay, according to the messages and interviews. One person said the men also paid in cash, sometimes withdrawn from a hotel ATM. There's also allegation of drug use. There's a clarification from the Times that is a violation of federal child sex trafficking law to provide someone under 18 with anything of value in exchange for sex, which can include meals, hotels, drugs, alcohol, cigarettes. There's a 10-year mandatory minimum prison sentence for anybody convicted of that crime. Mr. Gaetz denies ever paying any woman for sex or having any underage relationships. But this story is considerably advanced by the Times. We'll be right back.
Designed to deploy in minutes, Audit is cloud-based software that lets you manage the network from anywhere. You'll stop network bottlenecks and security vulnerabilities in their tracks. You'll mitigate network risk.
This week, the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, asked the White House for special help for Michigan. She asked the White House to help meet the surge in cases in her state with a new surge of vaccines to her state. In places where we have big surges in cases, raises this interesting question. Can we flood those zones with even more vaccines than they might otherwise get? I mean, it makes sense, right? At least in layman's terms, it makes sense in terms of trying to get around the epidemic, trying to get on the other side of it, for two main reasons, right? I mean, the risks of having tons of virus floating around, having tons of copious transmission anywhere in the country, it's the same as risk that we had even before we had vaccines, right? Copious transmission means people are getting sick and people are dying. With vaccines, that may be somewhat mitigated by the fact that older people are more likely to have vaccine-induced immunity now, but still, the same patterns that we saw, rise in cases, rise in hospitalizations, rise in deaths, it still holds, it's still happening. Also, though, now, more so than before, there's the additional risk of copious transmission anywhere in the country. With all the variants that are out there now, the more transmissible, more dangerous variants that are out there, right now with all the variants circulating, copious transmission anywhere in the country means more opportunity for the virus to mutate and to potentially defeat someday, vaccines and the therapies that are currently working against them. More transmission equals more reproduction of the virus equals more mutation of the virus, which means more circulation and potentially development of new virulent bad variants. So if you can surge vaccines to places that have upticks in cases, doesn't that make sense, right? Vaccinated people don't get infected, mostly, which means they help to stop the exponential spread. They also don't help the virus develop even more potentially dangerous mutations. They also don't get sick, and they don't have to go to the hospital, and they don't die. I mean, wherever we have, the vaccine rollout is going great. The vaccine rollout is exceeding expectations in considerable ways. Is it a reasonable case that Michigan is making, that places that have tons of transmission, that places that have worrying surges of transmission ought to be prioritized for additional surges in vaccines? Joining us now is Dr. Peter Hotez. He's co-director of the Center for Vaccine Development at Texas Children's Hospital. He's also dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. Dr. Hotez, thank you so much for making time tonight.
Thanks so much for having me.
Americans expect their elections to have safeguards. Only then can we have confidence the results are fair and accurate. Incredibly, some in Congress want to strip away those critical safeguards. No more voter ID, signature verification of absentee ballots, virtually eliminating and effectively allowing non-citizens to vote. The list goes on. Every illegal vote cancels someone's legitimate vote, like yours. Tell your senators your vote matters. Tell them to vote no on Senate Bill 1.
In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, I command you to give me your name.
Good. Nice job, everybody. It's you.
Sí, anda por aquí. Lo vi hace un rato.
Everybody, here we go. 3, 2.
So I obviously am not a doctor and not an epidemiologist and not an expert in any of this. And so I just wanted to give you a chance to kind of set me straight. That's how I just explained how I'm sort of feeling about this as an issue and what seems like a reasonable policy adaptation to consider. Is there some of this that I'm not understanding, or if I got any of this the wrong way around?
Well, Rachel, it's turned out you've learned a lot of epidemiology over the last 14 months, so that's a pretty good assessment, actually. I think a couple of things to think about. One, the major variant overwhelmingly in the U.S. is the B117 variant, originally from the United Kingdom. Yes, we have the other variants from South Africa and Brazil here, and the California variant, but the one that really is accelerating right now and the one that's keeping us all up at night is the B117 variant. And that's likely accounting for the big rise in cases in Brazil, in Michigan, and it's also accounting for a lot of hospitalizations now among younger people. So this variant is more transmissible, it has higher mortality as well, and higher hospitalization rates. The issue is the B117 variant is not only in Michigan, it's across the upper Midwest, it's across New England, it's across New York and New Jersey, and it's here in Texas and Florida and Georgia in a big way. So the thinking is what's happening in Michigan now is probably a harbinger of things to come in the rest of the country very soon. That's one big issue. And the other is a lot of states are underperforming in terms of testing. So some of that variance may reflect the level of testing. For instance, in Kansas, the level of testing was recently reported to be quite low, so it might be far worse than we actually realize. And then there's the question of bandwidth. Even if we supplied more vaccine to Michigan, would they have the capacity to manage it and be able to vaccinate it? And it may be the case. So there may be some wiggle room in terms of supplying extra vaccine, but the bottom line is the B117 variant is just about getting everywhere now. We've got to accelerate and vaccinate the country as fast as possible. And by the way, this was all predicted and predictable. And I have to say the Biden administration did respond. You know, if you remember, Rachel, back in January after the inauguration, they gave the 100 vaccinations and 100 million vaccinations in 100 days, and it was looking reasonable. But then we saw the rapid rise of the B117 variant, and the scientific community said to the Biden administration, including myself, hold on, this isn't going to work anymore, because now with the B117 variant, we have to vaccinate by the end of the spring. And they responded, and they put in place a plan. So they are clearly very responsive to what's happening. In terms of the specifics for Michigan, it may make sense to supply some additional vaccine, but this is going to start going up in every state now until we can get to more than half the country vaccinated. And by the way, we're going to get there pretty soon. I think in 4 to 5 weeks, we're going to be in much better shape. It's a matter of how we navigate now the next 4 or 5 weeks.
Look at this. This was the front page of the Cincinnati Enquirer today. To the right of the big story about baseball's opening day, we get this above-the-fold 700-word story about a local bridge and how Biden's new infrastructure plan could fund it. Quote, state and federal officials' plans aligned this week to bring the greater Cincinnati region closer, maybe, to funding its biggest single public works project, a new bridge over the Ohio River. This is what local papers have been like across the country for the last 24 hours. Houston Chronicle today. Biden's infrastructure pitch aims at Texas. Here's the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, hailing the White House, specifically mentioning the Claiborne Expressway in their town. Here's the Indianapolis Star. It says, yes, please, in all caps. Yes, please. Amtrak proposal with new Indianapolis routes has people talking. It's kind of cool to see local papers like this, right? Excited about the prospect of big, really overdue, potentially awesome investments in their area. And things that'll benefit everybody, right? New train lines, tearing down blighted old infrastructure that messed up your town, building new bridges in places where you really need new bridges because the old ones are falling down. This is the kind of stuff that has tons of local support, and you can see this palpable excitement around the country as people start to realize that if this infrastructure bill passes, what it might mean for their town, for their city, for their state. The plan also just has really broad support among voters. A couple of weeks ago, there was a Data for Progress Invest in America poll that found support for a large infrastructure plan among likely voters nationwide was almost 70%. That includes 50% of likely Republican voters. Still today, the Republican leader in the Senate said that no matter what's in the bill, 0 Republicans will vote for it, which means Democrats won't have to expend energy talking to Republican senators about how they want to whittle this thing down and not really do it. Democrats instead can focus on negotiating among themselves, which means, if anything, this $2 trillion package might get even bigger. It also means that this package, this bill, this plan from President Biden is popular with Democrats in Congress, with Democratic voters, with Republican voters, and just not with Republicans in Congress. So Republicans in Congress represent no one on this. But what the president is trying to do has broad-based support, including from Republicans voters who disagree with their own members of Congress on this. That seems like a pretty solid political footing on which to move forward. And here's the part of it that I think is going to seem counterintuitive to a lot of people, but is also more jet fuel on this for Biden. President Biden is proposing to pay for this investment by raising some taxes, by raising the corporate tax rate on the biggest, most profitable corporations in the country, many of which famously pay no federal taxes at all. It turns out that that only makes the bill more popular. Literally, the bill is more popular when you tell people it's going to be paid for by new corporate taxes than it is if you just don't tell them anything about how it's going to be paid for. Like, I like it. Okay, it's going to be paid for by new corporate taxes. Oh, I like it a lot. A recent Politico Morning Consult poll found that voters by a 2-to-1 margin support paying for the plan by raising taxes on corporations and the highest earners. This bodes well for the Democrats looking to pass this plan the way Biden wants to pass it, or potentially even a bigger version of it. But I think it'd be remiss not to notice that this also indicates a whole new politics surrounding this issue. I mean, Republicans' standard austerity governments around this issue are not even convincing their own voters anymore. So does that mean now that something new is possible that wasn't possible before we got to this point? Joining us now is Heather McGhee. She's chair of the board of directors at Color of Change. She's also the author of what is probably the most influential book on the American left right now. It's called The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. Ms. McGhee, it's a real honor to have you here. Thanks so much for making time.
Happy to be with you.
Let me ask you about the sort of premise here that I laid out, that the politics that we used to think applied to government action on things like infrastructure or even things like healthcare or any other thing that the government might do maybe don't apply anymore, that the idea of austerity and government's inability to do anything right, that those arguments don't even resonate among Republican voters anymore. Do you think that premise is right?
I think the premise is largely true because Americans are sick of worrying about what part of this country is going to fall apart next. We know that our infrastructure, which used to be the envy of the world, now gets a C or D grade from the American Society of Civil Engineers. We know that too many families are worried about what's coming out of their tap. This bill meets America's needs, and the only thing that Republicans have going for them in terms of a strategy is white identity politics. That's what I write about in The Sum of Us, the idea that really they've been able to pull together and maintain a majority of white voters to keep putting them back in office, even though they're delivering relatively zero on an economic agenda, because of identity politics. It's the idea of the drained pool, right? The way that so many towns across the country managed to drain their public swimming pools that were segregated rather than integrate them. And that's really what's been happening over the last 50 years. That's why there are so many unmet needs, because it's been hard to get a majority support to invest in America that's becoming more diverse. But I do believe that is changing now.
And that's changing now. I mean, as you talk about in the book, and I think in a way that you've argued that's really penetrated a lot of people's consciousness, is the idea that it is a multiracial coalition of American voters coming from all sorts of different backgrounds and all sorts of different ideological stripes who sort of decided, with the drained pool metaphor, that actually it'd be nice to have swimming pools again, and that it would be nice to have things in common that we all benefit from, and the idea that we shouldn't have anything because we shouldn't have the idea that we shouldn't have anything if we can't have it only for ourselves, only for our subgroup. It's an idea that's just curdled for a big enough number of Americans that even if it continues to work with some white voters, it's never going to be a majority again.
That's right. I mean, that's what we have to hope, right? We have to hope that this is the kind of solidarity politics that can remain. But you see what the right-wing strategy is, right? The original COVID bill is something that, the Republicans felt pretty confident that they could refuse support, even though it had supermajority support in the country. Why? Dr. Seuss, right? The threat that Democrats are canceling things that white Americans support and love and know because they think it's racist. You know, the whole theatrics around the running to the border, the zero-sum politics about opening schools instead of opening borders. This is what they have. This is the hand they have to play. And yet this bill will meet so many unmet needs. It needs to be bigger, right? If this is going to be our once-in-a-generation shot, it needs to have a lot more green jobs to it. It needs to be more aggressive, actually, on addressing climate change, because we only have so many years. But this is the chance, right? This is the chance for us to say this was why people waded through high water to vote in November and again in January, because of things that could transform our communities.
And if you can't do it with supermajority support and Democratic Party control of the House and the Senate and the White House, when are you going to be able to do it? Heather McGee, chair of the board of directors at Color of Change, as I mentioned, the author of The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, which is just wicked smart and super influential, and it deserves it. Heather, thank you so much for your time tonight. It's great to have you here. Look at this. This was...
Oh my gosh.
Somebody pulled up that motherfucker quick. Oh my God. What? We lost by fucking 60 points?
She's here.
Listen, I have a story for you.
Something the Examiner will love.
The girl was working miracles after a visitation from the Virgin Mary.
She's here.
You think there could be other forces at play here?
When God builds a church, the devil builds a chapel next door.
Don't doubt her.
So in response to Georgia's new law that makes it harder for people of color to vote, Major League Baseball moving the season's All-Star Game out of Atlanta, the commissioner explaining the decision in the statement saying Major League Baseball fundamentally supports voting rights for all Americans and opposes restrictions at the ballot box. The Atlanta Braves, who are going to be hosting the game, saying that they are, quote, deeply disappointed, adding that they had hoped our city could use this event as a platform to enhance the discussion. So let's have a discussion now. Hall of Fame broadcaster Bob Costas is here, CNN contributor. Bob, I love having these conversations with you. You always give us such nuance and such great information here, and such a great perspective. This is really a huge decision from Major League Baseball, because at the same time that we're learning tonight, the PGA Tour is planning to keep the Tour Championship in Georgia. Give me your initial reaction to all of this.
Well, there's so many aspects to it. One that strikes me is that until relatively recently, baseball was not as apt as a sport to weigh in on social issues as perhaps the NBA, the WNBA, the NFL. But that all changed. I mean, last year was obviously a time of reckoning, and it continues. There's a players' alliance now in baseball, made up primarily of players of color, primarily African-American players, but also widely supported by white players around Major League Baseball. So there are still some people who are going to say, stick to sports, stick to sports. But as we've discussed before, Don, there is a long history of athletes using their platform to register a point of view and to be, in many cases, effective and in some cases even profound. The question is going to be going forward on a case-by-case basis. Is this always the right sort of approach? There may be some people who are in agreement overall, have some differences with some aspect, or differences with the approach. Stacey Abrams has said she has mixed feelings about it. You can understand how the Atlanta Braves feel about it. There are people who feel that this is taking some economic opportunity away from those who would benefit from having a big event like an All-Star Game, and some of those people are relatively lower on the economic ladder. So I understand those objections, but the larger point that's being made here is that, as Daniel Dale pointed out about an hour ago with you, yeah, you can claim, as Governor Kemp did, that there are certain provisions within this bill that will enhance access to voting. But in the overall, on balance, it actually restricts voting, and it's clear that it will most negatively impact people of color and people at the lower end of the economic scale. And so this is what baseball has decided to do. Now, this is also different when you talk about the PGA Tour, you talk about the Masters next week. The Masters is only in one place at one time. Baseball can move its All-Star Game, and it will, to someplace else. So these players are still going to play in an All-Star Game.
You know, it's interesting that you brought up what Daniel Dale said, because you know, I've been reading a lot about what's happening with the voter laws in Georgia, and I think the main thing that people have to remember, right? There's a lot of misinformation going around and half-truths, and we know that happens. But the main thing people should remember is that the initial, the impetus of this, it was a lie about the election that it started from. Now, it may enhance ours in some places, it may take certain things away, but it was built initially on a lie, and we must keep that in mind. So we have to start from the truth with this. Let me ask you about the mayor of Atlanta, Keisha Lance Bottoms, also Martin Luther King III, Dodgers owner Magic Johnson, LeBron James as well. They have ownership. LeBron James has ownership stake in the Boston Red Sox. They're all tweeting that they support the move. What do you say to people who think that this is cancel culture or baseball being too, you know, quote, woke? I know those are catchphrases, and I hate little catchphrases, but what do you know what I'm saying?
They're catchphrases